Hello, and welcome to the first module of the MMPI 2RF Independent Study Training Program, Introduction to the MMPI 2RF. My name is Taylor Lee, and I will serve as the instructor for this portion of the program. Module 1 consists of 5 units, which will cover the historical foundations of the MMPI 2RF, as well as how the instrument was developed. We're going to discuss what documentation is available, methods of administering and scoring the restructured form, and the types of score reports that are available. Finally, we will discuss resources available for using the restructured form in specific settings. At the conclusion of this module, you will have the information needed to address several specific objectives. These include why revisions have been made across the history of the MMPI, the development of the MMPI 2RF, basic similarities and differences between the MMPI 2 and the MMPI 2RF, and the basic applications, features, and materials and reports available for the MMPI 2RF. We're now going to start Unit 1, Background, and this unit will focus on the historical foundations of the restructured form. The MMPI 2RF is the most recent addition to the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory family of instruments, all of which were intended to provide objective information about a test taker's functioning. The restructured form was developed by Dr. Joseph Ben-Perath from Kent State University and Dr. Alka Tellegen from the University of Minnesota. To provide you a context for understanding why Drs. Ben-Perath and Tellegen developed the restructured form, let's hear from Dr. Ben-Perath.
In developing the MMPI 2RF, our goal was to take what already was the most widely used and studied self-report measure of personality and psychopathology and modernize it, bring it into the 21st century, if you will. The MMPI original version of the test, of course, was developed in the late 1930s, early 1940s. The MMPI 2 came out in 1989. And our goal was to take what was a very solid foundation, the tried and true items of the MMPI 2RF, and apply modern test construction techniques to those items, link the resulting scales with current models and concepts in the field of personality and psychopathology, and provide users of the test with a measure that gives the most up-to-date, relevant information about the psychological functioning of individuals who take the test.
As Dr. Ben-Perath just mentioned, the goal he and Dr. Tellegen had in developing the MMPI 2RF was to modernize the MMPI family of instruments. The first instrument in this family was the MMPI, which was developed in the late 1930s and early 1940s by psychologist Stark Hathaway and psychiatrist J. Charnley McKinley at the University of Minnesota Hospital. In developing the MMPI, Hathaway and McKinley's goal was to develop a self-report instrument that would provide an efficient and reliable method of determining psychiatric diagnoses. They were especially interested in developing scales that would assist with the task of differential diagnosis. Starting with a pool of well over 1,000 items, Hathaway and McKinley developed 8 scales that were intended to assess psychiatric diagnoses that were frequently observed in the hospital setting. These diagnoses were described in Kraepelinian nosology and included hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviance, paranoia, psychasthenia, schizophrenia, and hypomania. The 8 scales Hathaway and McKinley developed became known as the clinical scales, and a manual describing their development, scoring, and interpretation was published in 1943. The MMPI quickly gained widespread acceptance for use in practice, largely due to the empirical foundations that guided the development of the clinical scales. However, although MMPI scale scores were intended to assist in differential diagnosis, it quickly became clear that they did not work as Hathaway and McKinley had intended. This conclusion was reached because of an excessive rate of false positives. Patients with a specific diagnosis often achieved high scores on reportedly unrelated clinical scales. It was also observed that individuals with no observable psychopathology sometimes achieved scores indicative of problems. Subsequently, the developers and users of the MMPI worked to understand why clinical scales did not function as differential diagnostic indicators. This work uncovered 2 primary psychometric weaknesses in the clinical scales. First, it was demonstrated that clinical scales of the MMPI were highly intercorrelated. The large correlations observed between clinical scale scores indicated it was unlikely an individual would elevate a single scale. These excessive correlations were thought to be the result of items that were scored on more than one scale or item overlap, as well as shared features of the disorders that were targeted for assessment with the clinical scales. Second, it was demonstrated that individuals with very different types of problems and difficulties could elevate the same scale. This was in large part due to heterogeneous item content reflected in the items scored on a particular clinical scale. This heterogeneous item content was largely the result of the empirical keying approach used by Hathaway and McKinley to develop the scales, which captured the multifaceted nature of the syndromes they were trying to assess. In response to these psychometric challenges, proponents of the MMPI advocated for several ad hoc solutions that were intended to assist in clarifying clinical scale interpretations. The first of these was the use of code types. Code types were combinations of elevated clinical scale scores that reflected purportedly more distinct constructs than those reflected in the clinical scales alone. The code type approach enabled a test taker to be described using what research suggested other individuals who scored similarly were like, and became a prevalent approach to MMPI interpretation. The second approach was to develop scales using the MMPI item pool intended to assess more narrow constructs than those assessed by the clinical scales. These scale development efforts were included both the development of subscales that assess specific facets of the clinical scales, as well as supplementary scales that were primarily intended to assess constructs not assessed by the clinical scales. The MMPI was updated and released in its second edition, the MMPI-2, in 1989. The primary focus of the revision to the MMPI-2 was the collection and establishment of a new set of norms. Prior to the MMPI-2 revision, norms were based in data collected in the 1940s from a large group of individuals living in Minnesota. This had resulted in many test users having serious concerns about the adequacy of the normative sample. The clinical scales were left intact in the revision to the MMPI-2. This was done in order to maintain continuity between the original MMPI and the MMPI-2, largely to allow test users to continue using the large body of literature that had been developed for code types when interpreting the MMPI-2. However, the authors of the MMPI-2 recognized that the code type approach didn't entirely overcome the psychometric problems associated with the clinical scales. Thus, they also added additional items that were combined into scales with existing MMPI items to form the content scales. These scales were introduced at the time the MMPI-2 was released in 1989. The content scales were intended to assess the clinically relevant constructs represented in the MMPI's item pool in a psychometrically stronger manner than the original content scale or clinical scales. Also introduced with the MMPI-2 were several new validity scales, including Vren, Trent, and FB. These scales were intended to complement the existing MMPI validity scales used to assess under and over reporting. Scale scores on Vren and Trent assessed non-content-based random and fixed response styles, while FB scores were intended to assess over-reporting that occurred while answering items administered during the second half of the MMPI. Finally, when the MMPI-2 was released in 1989, several scales that had been regularly scored were deleted from the manual, largely due to research indicating scores on these scales lacked evidence supporting their validity, or had constructs that were assessed by psychometrically stronger scales that could be scored from the MMPI-2 item pool. Developments to the MMPI-2 since it was released in 1989 have primarily centered on adding and removing scales from those that are routinely scored based on empirical findings. Added scales include those like the infrequency psychopathology scale that was added in 1995, the personality psychopathology 5 scales that were added in 2002, and the restructured clinical or RC scales that were added in 2003. The addition of the RC scales to the standardly scored scales of the MMPI-2 in 2003 marks a particularly important endeavor, as these scales were intended to directly address the known limitations of the clinical scales, that strong intercorrelations and the excessive heterogeneity within scales that we discussed earlier. We're going to come back to our discussion of the restructured clinical scales in the next module when we discuss the development of the restructured form, as these RC scales form the core of the restructured form instrument. After its release, the MMPI-2 became as widely used as its predecessor, the MMPI. As such, the revision process was largely viewed as a success. However, the decision to leave the clinical scales intact, despite their known psychometric weaknesses, and continued pursuit of the ad hoc solutions that had been developed for the MMPI, meant that many of the challenges of the MMPI were also present for the MMPI-2. These lingering challenges directly led to the development of the latest member of the MMPI family of instruments, the one we're discussing today, the restructured form. This brings us to the end of Unit 1, Background. Please answer the following question to check your knowledge. The next unit in our training module will focus on the development of the restructured form. Let's start by hearing from Dr. Ben Parath.
The MMPI-2RF has 51 scales. That's a lot of scales. And the reason we have so many scales on the restructured form is that we wanted to develop a comprehensive assessment instrument. So we have several sets of scales. We have, of course, validity scales that give us information about how the individual approached the test, whether they were able to understand and respond relevantly to the content of the test items, whether there are any indications of over-reporting or under-reporting. And then we have 42 substantive scales. They're organized in a hierarchical structure. The broadest level of measurement, we have the 3 higher order scales. And these scales indicate whether a test taker presents and to what extent with problems in the domains of mood and affect, disordered thinking, or under-control behavior. The second tier of measurement is represented by the 9 restructured clinical scales, or the RC scales. And the RC scales are the common denominator between the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-2RF. They really represented the first effort to restructure and modernize the MMPI clinical scales. And we also have 23 specific problem scales. Those are the most narrowly focused measures on the restructured form and provide information that either complements what we get from the RC scales or augments that information by getting into other domains of functioning or dysfunction. We also have interest scales and another set of scales called the Psi-5 or Personality Psychopathology 5. So we do have a lot of scales on the test, and learning how to take all that information and integrate it into an overall interpretation is a process, but well worth it, because at the end of this process you will achieve and obtain a comprehensive assessment of the individual's psychological functioning.
I'm going to start off this unit by providing some basic facts about the restructured form. The MMPI-2RF was initially published in 2008, and a set of updated manuals for the instrument were released in 2011. The instrument consists of a subset of 338 of the 567 items that are scored on the MMPI-2. The MMPI-2RF's normative sample is based on the normative sample of the MMPI-2. Unlike the MMPI-2, however, the restructured form uses non-gendered norms, and its normative sample consists of an equal number of men and women drawn from the individuals who comprised the MMPI-2 normative sample. There are 51 scales scored on the restructured form. This includes 9 validity scales, which are intended to assess a test taker's response style, as well as 42 substantive scales, which assess aspects of the individual's personality and experience of psychopathology. The 42 scales of the MMPI-2RF are grouped into scale families, including the higher order, or HO, restructured clinical, or RC, revised personality psychopathology 5, or Psi-5, specific problems, and interest scales. The MMPI-2RF is arranged in a hierarchical fashion, and at the top of the MMPI-2RF hierarchy are the higher order scales, and scores on these scales provide a broad range of information about the test taker's functioning. The restructured clinical scales are in the middle of this hierarchy, and these scales are intended to provide increasingly detailed information about the test taker and assess the core distinctive constructs that were captured in Hathaway and McKinley's 8 original clinical scales. And finally, the specific problem scales are at the lowest level of the restructured form hierarchy. These scales are intended to assess very narrow and highly specific types of problems or characteristics the test taker may have. Specifically, these scales are standalone scales designed to highlight important characteristics subsumed by or associated with the RC scales, or to measure unique constructs not assessed by those mid-level scales. Since its release in 2008, scores on the scales of the MMPI-2RF have been extensively investigated. You're going to hear some more about these studies in later modules. Now that you have a frame of reference for the instrument, I'd like to discuss the development process. The overall objective for developing the MMPI-2RF was to represent the clinically significant substance of the MMPI-2 item pool with a comprehensive set of psychometrically up-to-date measures. In other words, Drs. Ben-Porath and Tellegen aimed to develop an exhaustive yet efficient means of assessing the clinically relevant constructs represented in the MMPI-2 item pool, and they aimed to do this in a manner that remedied the psychometric shortcomings of the clinical scales that we discussed in our previous unit. The overall strategy for doing this was to first restructure the clinical scales in a manner that addressed the known psychometric limitations of these scales. This goal was accomplished when the restructured clinical scales were published in 2003. Drs. Tellegen and Ben-Porath then wanted to supplement the assessment offered by the RC scales by developing additional measures that would assess other important constructs captured in the MMPI-2 item pool. Developing additional scales that augmented the RC scales was needed to achieve the goal of the restructured form, providing a comprehensive assessment of the test taker's functioning. As I just mentioned, the development of the restructured form began by restructuring the original 8 clinical scales of the MMPI developed by Hathaway and McKinley. Dr. Tellegen began the process of restructuring the clinical scales in the early 1990s, and the project culminated in 2003 when the RC scales were added to the MMPI-2. The results of these efforts were published in a monograph, which is displayed for you on the screen. The RC scales scored on the MMPI-2 were directly carried over to the restructured form. Development of the RC scales proceeded in 4 steps. The first step was to capture demoralization. Demoralization was thought to be a common factor that led to intercorrelation amongst the clinical scales, as it reflected non-specific distress that was common to all of the difficulties Hathaway and McKinley had set out to assess when developing the clinical scales. The consequence of measuring demoralization in each of the clinical scales had been that the scores on these scales had limited discriminant validity. Thus, the idea was that by removing and measuring demoralization in a separate scale, the psychometric properties of the subsequently developed scales could be improved. The second step of the RC scale process was to identify the major distinctive core components of each of the original clinical scales. A feature was considered to be distinctive and a core component if it measured something that was not highly associated with demoralization or any of the core components identified for the other clinical scales. In step 3, seed scales were constructed. These seed scales were intended to assess the core components identified in the previous step. They were made up of subsets of original clinical scale items that had been identified via factor analysis and correlational procedures as being distinctive measures of these core components. A series of analyses of it were completed to ensure that the seed scales were maximally distinctive from one another. The fourth step in deriving the RC scales was to create the final set of RC scales. With the seed scales that had been developed in the previous step, Tellegen and colleagues used correlational analyses to identify additional items from the MMPI-2 item pool that primarily assessed the core component captured in each seed scale. This process ended in the 9 restructured clinical scales, which assessed demoralization and the distinctive core component of Hathaway and McKinley's original 8 clinical scales. After the RC scales had been introduced to the MMPI-2, work continued on several other psychometrically efficient scales for inclusion in the restructured form. Drs. Tellegen and Ben-Porath were specifically interested in developing scales for the MMPI-2RF that assessed distinctive core components from the original clinical scales that were not covered by the RC scales, as well as other constructs that were not directly measured by the RC scales. They were also interested in developing scales that would reflect facets of the broader RC scales that warranted separate assessment. Dr. Tellegen and Ben-Porath also aimed to develop a set of higher order scales that were intended to assess broad domains of personality and psychopathology. The goal here was to provide a hierarchically organized interpretive framework for the test. Lastly, the test authors worked to revise existing and develop new measures of response validity. We're now going to take a minute to discuss the results of each of these efforts in a bit more detail. The MMPI family of instruments were among the first to include measures of response validity, or scales that would indicate a test taker responded to items in a manner that threatened the validity of their specific protocol. Given the importance of assessing response styles, the restructured form contains revised versions of MMPI validity scales, as well as 2 new validity scales. Several MMPI-2 validity scales were carried over to the restructured form, though they were revised to provide more effective and discriminate methods of assessing protocol validity. The revisions of existing MMPI-2 validity scales focus primarily on eliminating overlapping items and identifying additional items that assess the response style of interest, or reflected infrequent responses in the new MMPI-2RF normative sample. MMPI-2 scales that were revised for the MMPI-2RF include markers of content non-responsiveness, cannot say, VRIN, and TRIN, revised versions of markers of underreporting including uncommon virtues, a revision of L, and adjustment validity, a revision of K, as well as markers of overreporting including infrequent responses, infrequent psychopathology responses, and the symptom validity scale, which are revised versions of F, FP, and FBS. Tellegen and Ben-Perath also wanted to ensure the MMPI-2RF was able to assess threats to protocol validity that had been observed in non-clinical settings where the MMPI-2 had been frequently used. Thus, they added 2 new validity scales that assessed over-reporting of somatic symptoms, the infrequent somatic responses, or FS scale, and exaggerated memory complaints, the response bias scale, or RBS. FS was constructed by identifying items that were infrequently endorsed by medical patients. RBS was created by identifying items that had predicted failure on performance validity tests in a forensic disability setting. Tellegen and Ben-Perath also aimed to develop higher-order scales that assess broad psychopathology domains, with the intention that these scales would provide an organizing interpretive framework for the restructured form. A series of factor analyses of the RC scales in various samples had led to the identification of a consistently interpretable 3-factor structure. After these 3 factors were identified, additional analyses were conducted to select items to measure these domains from the pool of 567 items available in the MMPI-2 item pool. Tellegen and Ben-Perath named the higher-order scales developed using these procedures emotional internalizing dysfunction, or EID, behavioral externalizing dysfunction, or BXD, and thought dysfunction, or THD. These scales assess classic dispositional distinctions corresponding to affect, thinking, and behavior. As I mentioned previously, Ben-Perath and Tellegen also developed more narrowly focused scales that were intended to augment the higher order and restructured clinical scales and ensure the MMPI-2RF comprehensively assessed a broad range of constructs. The result of these efforts was the 23 specific problem scales. To create the specific problem scales, Tellegen and Ben-Perath factor analyzed relevant substantive item domains. This included items that had been reflected previously in clinical scales 5, masculinity, femininity, and 0, social introversion, items that measured components of clinical scales that were identified during the RC scale development process but were not developed into scales, things like social anxiety, items that reflected facets of the larger constructs captured in the RC scales, such as scores on RC4 assessing substance use and antisocial behavior, which the test authors believed warranted separate assessment, and items that reflected clinically substantive attributes that were not represented in either the clinical or RC scales, things like suicidal ideation and behavior. After these items were identified, Ben-Perath and Tellegen created these scales using a process similar to that used to create the RC scales. Specifically, they assembled seed scales to maximize the distinctiveness of the resulting scales from one another. They then examined the correlations between each of the 567 items of the MMPI-2 item pool and the seed scales to identify which items should be recruited to add to these seed scales. They then conducted analyses to optimize scale reliability, distinctiveness, and meaningfulness. As part of this process, they took into consideration association of the scales they had developed with external criteria. They conducted this step to ensure that the developed SP scales could be meaningfully linked to indicators of external validity. A final set of scales developed for the restructured form are revised versions of the Personality Psychopathology 5 or Psy-5 scales. These scales are revised versions of MMPI-2 scales that assess a dimensional model of personality pathology, the Psy-5 model developed by Alan Harkness and John McNulty. The Psy-5 model reflects adaptive and maladaptive personality characteristics such as those currently described by personality disorder diagnoses. Once the 338 items of the restructured form were identified, Harkness and McNulty revised the MMPI-2-based versions of the Psy-5 to be assessed with the reduced item pool. This brings us to the end of Unit 2, Development. Please answer the following question to check your knowledge. Our next unit in this training module will focus on the materials available for the restructured form, which will allow me to describe various features of the instrument as well. Let's begin by hearing from Dr. Ben Perath.
The MMPI-2RF materials include manuals and software-based reports. We have two manuals, a manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation. And that manual provides users with information on how to do just that, administer, score, and interpret the MMPI-2RF. The technical manual provides a lot of the psychometric details, some information about the development of the test, but also reliability estimates, standard errors of measurement, comprehensive validation information. And we have the user's guide for reports as the third test document. And that describes the two software-based reports for the MMPI-2RF, the score report, which includes all the scale scores as well as item level information, and our interpretive report that focuses on interpreting scores in clinical settings, includes the scale scores and item level information, as well as a computer-generated interpretation of the results. The interpretation is fully annotated. We wanted it to be transparent, so the annotation provides all of the information about which scales triggered each of the statements in the report, what scores on the scales, and what the nature of the interpretation is. And if it's based on empirical correlates, the report will include a list of references where users can find the actual empirical data that support the interpretation. That transparency really guided the entire process of developing the test. The software also includes options for customizing the reports for very specific applications, or if the user wants to get additional item level information. And in addition, we also have some setting-specific interpretive reports.
The first document available to guide use of the restructured form is the Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation. As the name implies, this manual provides information about how and with whom to administer the restructured form, how the instrument is scored, as well as what interpretations can be made about test takers based on the scores on the instrument. To be more specific about the types of information presented in this manual, it contains 5 chapters, each of which I will talk briefly about. The first chapter is the introduction. This chapter describes the instrument and the available materials. The second chapter describes the intended uses of the restructured form, including in what context and with whom the restructured form can be used. These are largely the same as the contexts and individuals with whom the MMPI-2 can be used. This chapter also outlines the qualifications a test taker needs to administer and interpret the instrument. Finally, this chapter also contains information about the importance of test security, providing specific guidance on which materials are protected and how to respond to requests for test materials in the context of litigation. The third chapter outlines the composition of the normative sample for the restructured form, which, as you may recall from earlier in this presentation, is a subset of the MMPI-2 normative sample. Descriptions of the normative sample also provide the rationale for using non-gendered norms. It is still possible to compare an individual's scores to gender-based comparison groups, something we'll discuss a little bit later. This chapter also describes how scale scores are standardized to T-scores and the process by which standardized scoring was derived for the instrument. With the exception of the validity and interest scales, restructured form scales are standardized using uniform T-scores, and this chapter discusses the rationale for this choice. The fourth chapter outlines what procedures a test user should follow to administer and score the restructured form. These are fairly standard for self-report measures of personality and psychopathology, but we will also talk about the importance of adhering to these standardized procedures. Finally, the fifth chapter outlines the procedures for interpreting the instrument. The manual outlines a method of organizing interpretations based on the structure of the restructured form scales, as well as provides specific recommendations based on information presented in the instrument's technical manual regarding how to interpret each of the 51 scales of the restructured form. This chapter also includes case illustrations which demonstrate how the organizational framework and individual scale interpretations can be integrated to provide a broad picture of the test taker's social, emotional, and behavioral functioning. The organizational approach and interpretation of individual scale scores will be covered in subsequent modules in this training program. The Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation also has several appendices that provide information about the instrument. Appendix A provides T-score conversion tables for each of the scales. Appendix B has scoring keys for each of the 51 scales. Appendix C contains a list of all 338 items of the restructured form, as well as tables that describe which scales of the RF these items are scored on and in what direction. Appendix D provides item metric data regarding reading level for each item, including the Lexile score and the Flex Kincaid reading level. And finally, Appendix E provides item conversion tables that indicate what number an MMPI-2 RF item is in the MMPI-2 booklet and vice versa. The second document available to guide use of the restructured form is the technical manual. Broadly, the technical manual has information about why and how the restructured form was developed, as well as extensive psychometric data including information regarding the reliability, standard errors, and validity of scale scores in various settings. To be more specific about the types of information presented in the technical manual, it begins with an introduction which provides information about what led to the development of the restructured form. Chapter 2 describes the scale development methods that were followed in constructing the MMPI-2 RF scales. Chapter 3 documents psychometric evidence supporting the use of MMPI-2 RF scales and includes summaries of some of the information provided in the appendices of this manual. Specifically, you'll find information on the reliability and standard errors of restructured form scale scores in the normative sample and in a large clinical sample, as well as summaries of the reliability evidence provided for a variety of other samples in the manual's appendices. Summaries of the evidence provided in the manual's appendices regarding validity of restructured form scores in a number of different settings are also provided in this chapter, as is information regarding the association of restructured form scales with MMPI-2 scales and MMPI-2 RF scales with one another. The technical manual has 5 appendices that actually comprise a majority of the manual. The first of these appendices is Appendix A, which provides external correlates for the substantive scales of the restructured form. Specifically, this appendix documents correlations between the 42 substantive scales of the restructured form with extra test criteria in a variety of samples. There are a few important things to note about Appendix A. Displayed here for you is the table of contents for this appendix, as well as some summary information. The first thing I want to point out is, as you can see in the table of contents, this appendix is comprised of 136 separate tables describing the association between restructured form substantive scores and different extra test criteria. In fact, this appendix contains over 53,000 correlations between substantive scores and 604 different extra test criteria. These 604 criteria include a wide variety of information, such as therapist reports of personality and psychopathology symptoms, data collected from reviews of medical charts or forensic records, and individual scores on established self-report measures of personality, psychopathology, and other important characteristics. The second thing to note here is that external validity data come from a wide variety of settings that reflect many of the contexts in which the MMPI family of instruments is frequently used. These include mental health outpatient and inpatient settings, substance use treatment programs, medical settings, and civil and criminal forensic settings, in addition to university settings. In total, these samples were comprised of over 4,300 men and 2,300 women. The last thing to note is that given the breadth and depth of these external correlates, it is fair to say these data form the base of information supporting the validity of the restructured form substantive scale scores. Additionally, these are the data test developers relied on in determining what types of interpretive statements could be made about test takers based on their restructured form scale scores. These interpretive statements are provided in Chapter 5 of the Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation in the section for each scale labeled Empirical Correlates. In selecting these statements, Drs. Tellegen and Ben-Porath selected those empirical correlates that replicated across the variety of settings or were consistent across men and women. The next appendix in the technical manual, Appendix B, provides information regarding the conversion of raw means and standard deviations to t-score values. This is primarily used in research studies. Appendix C contains comparisons of MMPI-2 and MMPI-2-RF booklet and normative samples. Specifically, this appendix contains data and summaries that were focused on answering two questions. First, the test developers were interested in determining the extent to which MMPI-2-RF scale scores derived from an MMPI-2 versus an MMPI-2-RF administration were similar. This was important to examine as data used to develop and validate scores on the restructured form were based on data collected using the MMPI-2 test booklet that contained all 567 items. As such, it was important to determine whether or not results would have been different if only the 338 items of the restructured form had been collected. As such, the test developers collected data using both forms of the instrument, and results of their analyses suggested the two forms were comparable and that there were no differences in the estimates of reliability and validity of scale scores between the two administration methods. Second, the test developers were interested in determining the extent to which the normative sample used for the restructured form was representative when the instrument was released. This question was of particular importance given that the restructured form norms were based on a subset of individuals from the MMPI-2 normative sample, which had been collected in the 1980s. To answer this question, Dr. Tellegen and Ben-Porath compared two cohorts, one tested during the normative sample collection in the 1980s and one that was collected at the time the restructured form was developed. Results of comparisons of these two groups indicated there was no evidence of normative change across the 20-year period, suggesting the norms were holding up across time. Appendix D in the technical manual has information about MMPI-2-RF comparison group data. These data are essentially means and standard deviations on the 51 scales of the instrument that allow us to compare test takers' results to a group of individuals who were tested for a similar purpose or in a similar circumstance. Displayed for you here is the list of all of the samples for whom comparison group data are available when using the restructured form that are described in Appendix D. You'll notice here that the first sample is the normative sample. I mentioned earlier that the restructured form uses non-gendered norms in deriving standardized scores, but that it was still possible to compare test takers' scores to scores obtained by individuals with the same identified gender. This is the way in which that can be done, as it is possible to contrast the scores obtained by a specific person to either the men or women of the normative sample using the tables in Appendix D. This is what the data actually look like in Appendix D. For each group, the mean and standard deviation in t-scores is presented. Thus, here, for the normative sample men and women, displayed in the leftmost columns, we can see that men and women score on average around 50 and have a standard deviation of approximately 10. This is the data for the normative sample and two outpatient samples, but data for any of the available comparison groups would look similar. Finally, Appendix E, the last appendix in the technical manual, contains information about MMPI-2 and MMPI-2-RF scale correlations in some of the settings in which the validity of the instrument scale scores were examined. This appendix allows test users to effectively determine where to find information on the restructured form that they are used to finding on a particular scale on the MMPI-2. The third and final set of documents available for the restructured form are the user's guides for reports. There's a general user's guide, the yellow cover booklets displayed here, which describes software-based score and interpretive reports available for the restructured form, as well as how to interface with software programs available for administering, scoring, and interpreting the restructured form. There are two more specific user's guide, the blue and gray covered booklets displayed here. These guides document the interpretive reports available for the police candidates and spine surgery and spinal cord stimulator candidates. To be more specific about the types of information presented in the user's guide for reports, it contains 5 chapters, each of which I'm going to introduce briefly. The first chapter is the introduction. This chapter describes the types of reports available, how to access automated scoring, and the qualifications test users need to use the results of automated scoring and reporting for the restructured form. The second chapter describes the basic score report, including the types of information that are included in this report and how to use user-designated item-level information. We'll talk more about each of these features in a few minutes. The third chapter outlines the standard comparison groups that are available for inclusion on a specific test taker's score report, as well as an overview of the user-generated comparison groups. The fourth chapter outlines the information provided in the clinical interpretive report, which provides not only a test taker's scores on the restructured form, but also empirically guided interpretations of what those scores suggest about the individual. We'll talk more about this type of report and see an example in a later part of this training. Finally, the fifth chapter outlines procedures generating reports, as well as how to create user-customized comparison groups that are specific to the setting in which you are using the instrument. The user's guide for the MMPI 2RF police candidate interpretive reports also contains 5 chapters. The first chapter is the introduction that discusses the intended uses and user qualifications for this report. The second and third chapter describe evidence supporting validity of the MMPI family of instruments in this specific high-stakes context, with special attention to the use of the restructured form in this setting in Chapter 3. The fourth chapter outlines the information provided in the police candidate interpretive report, which provides not only a test taker's scores on the restructured form, but also empirically guided interpretations of what those scores suggest about the individual based on the empirical findings discussed in Chapters 2 and 3. This chapter also describes the comparison sample of police candidates that can be used to compare specific candidates' responses and scores to. Finally, the fifth chapter outlines procedures for generating this type of report. The user's guide for the MMPI 2RF spine surgery and spinal cord stimulator candidate interpretive report also contains 5 chapters, and the manual is set up similarly to the police candidate report manual I just described. The first chapter is an introduction that discusses the intended uses and user qualifications for this report. The second and third chapter describe evidence supporting the validity of the MMPI family of instruments in these specific contexts, with special attention to use of the restructured form in these settings in Chapter 3. The fourth chapter outlines the information provided in the spine surgery and spinal cord stimulator candidate interpretive report. This chapter provides empirically grounded interpretations of what those MMPI 2RF scores suggest about an individual being evaluated in one of these contexts based on empirical findings, and who the comparison group data are comprised of. Finally, the fifth chapter outlines procedures for generating this type of report. This brings us to the end of Unit 3, Documentation. Please answer the following question to check your knowledge. Now I'd like to talk in a bit more detail about how a test user can administer, score, and obtain reports for the restructured form. There are several methods by which a test taker can administer, score, and obtain reports for the restructured form. These include digital methods via QGlobal or QLocal systems, traditional paper and pencil methods, or hybrid methods which use paper-pencil administration and automated scoring and reporting. Digital methods include using QGlobal and QLocal, both of which allow clinicians to administer the restructured form via computer, either on-screen via QLocal or online via QGlobal. After administration is complete, both systems offer immediate scoring and reporting. Materials for paper-pencil administration is also available, as are templates for hand scoring the administration. No automated reporting is available when hand scoring the test. Finally, it is possible to administer, score, and obtain reports via a mix of paper-pencil and automated scoring and reporting. In this case, item responses from an answer sheet completed from a paper-pencil administration are manually entered and verified by the test administrator in either QGlobal or QLocal, a process which takes approximately 15 to 20 minutes. After test responses have been entered, digital scoring and reporting are immediately available via these systems. As I just highlighted, for test users interested in digital or hybrid options, there are two system options. QGlobal is Pearson's web-based administration, scoring, and reporting system. QLocal is software with similar administration, scoring, and reporting functions, but it resides locally on your computer. Distinguishing features between QGlobal and QLocal, including accessibility, data storage, systems updates, are outlined on this slide. As you can see, basic administration, scoring, and reporting functionality are the same on QGlobal and QLocal. However, QGlobal offers tablet-based administration, full support for Mac's iOS operating system, automatic updates, and data backup, none of which are offered by QLocal. For test users interested in paper-pencil administration options, the test can be administered using a soft-covered test booklet that contains the 338 items of the restructured form. Booklets are available in English or Spanish. If you are using the booklets to administer the restructured form, you will also need an answer sheet. There are two answer sheets available. The first, the form with the blue bubbles displayed here, is for use when hand scoring the instrument. The second, the form with the red bubbles displayed here, is used when the responses will be scanned into one of the digital scoring systems just discussed. Additionally, for test users interested in pencil paper administration and scoring, a hand scoring kit is available. This kit includes MMPI-2RF test booklets, answer sheets, scoring templates, and forms on which you can record a test taker's MMPI-2RF score profile. Also included in this kit are the administration and technical manuals, as these contain information you will need during the hand scoring and interpretation process. Hand scoring the restructured form takes approximately 30 minutes once a test user has become proficient at using these materials. Hand scoring does not provide any automated score report options. These are only accessible through digital or hybrid administration scoring and reporting systems. For individuals electing to use digital or hybrid methods of administration and scoring, there are several automated reports available. I'm going to briefly describe each report and some other features associated with these reports. Then we'll discuss some of the pieces in a bit more detail. First, there's the basic score report. This report provides scores for a test taker on the 51 scales of the restructured form, as well as information about critical item responses. The second type of automated score report available is the interpretive report for clinical settings. This report has all of the features of the basic score report, but also includes interpretive statements regarding validity and substantive interpretations based on the test taker's MMPI-2RF scores. These interpretations are specifically focused on those relevant to individuals being evaluated in clinical settings and include diagnostic considerations as well as considerations for therapeutic process and treatment goals. The third available report is the Police Candidate Interpretive Report. Like the Clinical Interpretive Report, the Police Candidate Report has all of the features of the basic score report, but also includes interpretive statements regarding the validity and substantive interpretations based on the test taker's MMPI-2RF scores. In the case of this report, these interpretations are specifically focused on issues relevant to screening police candidates and are based on research using the MMPI-2RF in this context. This report also provides data from a comparison group of police officer candidates. The fourth available automated report is the Spine Surgery and Spinal Cord Stimulator Interpretive Report. This report also has all of the features of the basic score report, but also includes interpretive statements regarding the validity and substantive interpretations based on the test taker's MMPI-2RF scores. In the case of this report, these interpretations are specifically focused on issues relevant to screening spinal surgery and spinal cord stimulator candidates and are based on research using the MMPI-2RF in these contexts. Each of the reports I just described have report options that are customizable by the test user. This includes having specific item level information highlighted in the automated reports, as well as including comparison groups generated from restructured form data collected from groups of individuals in a test user's specific setting. We'll talk more about these customizable options in a few minutes. A unique feature of the interpretive reports I just described is the inclusion of annotated and interpretive statements. As you'll see in a few minutes when we look at this type of report, the test developers have included references for each and every interpretive statement that is provided in the interpretive reports for the restructured form. This was done in an effort to increase the transparency of using the instrument, as a test taker can review the sources of information each interpretation is derived from. These sources include the empirical correlates data that we described earlier as being available in the technical manual, but also findings from empirical studies on the instrument. To maintain the most up-to-date information in our interpretive reports, published studies are reviewed on a regular basis and findings are incorporated into the interpretation program. Finally, the last feature of using one of the digital methods of scoring and reporting is that the MMPI-2 can be converted into the MMPI-2 RF. This is possible as all 338 items scored on the restructured form are included in the 567 item pool of the MMPI-2. This feature is commonly used in research settings, but could also be used by individuals considering the restructured form or learning the instrument. Let's turn now to look at the basic score report. We'll review the structure of the score report with default reporting options, but we'll discuss customizable options for this report next. The basic score report begins with a page containing identifying information about the test taker. This information is entered into the system at the time of administration or manual entry. The next pages in the score report, pages 2 through 6, provide the test taker scores in both numerical and graphical formats. Here's page 2, and we're seeing the first of the reported scores, those for the validity scales. I'd like to point out a couple of things that are true for all of the reported MMPI-2 RF scores. As you can see below graphical displays of the test taker's scores, numerical score presentations include both raw and standardized T-scores for each scale. Reporting of scores also includes a description of the percentage of items scored on a particular scale that the test taker provided scoreable responses to, seen in the response percent row. A score of 100% would indicate the test taker provided a response of true or false to all items on a particular scale. There are a couple additional scores provided on this page that are not provided on subsequent pages of scores. The first of these is the total number of unscorable responses, which is a count of items that the test taker did not answer or answered as both true and false. This count is displayed in the cannot say raw score in the bottom left of the highlighted area. The second of these is the percentage of items the test taker answered as true about them. Another feature of the score report that you will see across the pages is that the average score, that of a T of score of 50, is marked by a solid line. Pages reporting substantive scores will also have demarcation lines signaling clinically interpretable high and low scores at T equal to 65 and T equal to 38. These are not provided for validity scales, as these scales do not have consistent cut scores like the substantive scales. Specific cut scores signaling the need for interpretation of validity scales will be discussed in subsequent parts of this training. The last feature you're going to see across the pages are the small lines that indicate the highest and lowest score that a test taker can achieve for a specific scale. I highlighted those here for VREN-R for you. The remaining pages 3 through 6 provide the graphical and numerical descriptions of a test taker's scores on the substantive scales. Displayed here for you is page 2, where we see the test taker's scores on the higher order and restructured clinical scales. As I mentioned, on pages where substantive scores are reported, we'll have clinical lines of demarcation at T equals 65 for clinically interpretable high scores, and another line at t=38 to demarcate clinically significant low scores. It's important to note at this point that while all MMPI-2 RF scales have clinically interpretable high scores, not all of the scales have clinically interpretable low scores. Those scales with clinically meaningful low score scale and interpretations are presented in Chapter 5 of the Manual of Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation, and will also be discussed in subsequent parts of this training. On page 4 of the score report, displayed for you here, we see the test taker scores on the somatic, cognitive, and internalizing specific problem scales. On the next page, page 5 of the score report, we see the externalizing and interpersonal specific problem scales, as well as the interest scales. Lastly, on page 6 of the score report, displayed here for you, we see the test taker scores on the Personality Psychopathology 5 or PSI-5 scales. The 7th page of the score report is a summary page that provides a numerical report of the test taker scores on the 51 scales of the restructured form. Rather than organized by scale family, these scales are organized into domains that parallel the structure recommended for interpreting the restructured form. These interpretation recommendations are provided in Chapter 5 of the Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation, but will also be discussed in later parts of this training. The remaining pages of the score report provide item-level information. One thing to note here is that in the slides I'm going to show you for the item-level information, we've not reproduced the content of the items for purposes of protecting the integrity of the test. In an actual score report, you would see the actual item content. Broadly, there are two types of item-level information that will always be included in the score report. The first of these is about unscorable items. Those items the test taker did not respond to or responded to as both true and false. For each of these items, the item content is provided, but also information about what scales this item is scored on. The second type of item-level information that will always be included in the score report are those items that have been designated as critical responses, or items that could indicate the need for immediate follow-up. These critical responses were designated by the test developers and include items from scales such as suicidal death ideation, helplessness, hopelessness, anxiety, ideas of persecution, aberrant experiences, substance abuse, and aggression. In the critical responses section, then, items in which the test taker endorsed one of these critical items as applying to them will be listed for you. These critical responses will be organized by the scales they are scored on, and information regarding how often the item is endorsed in this way in the normative sample will be provided to you. If you specified for a comparison group to be used in creating a particular score report, you will also see the percentage of time that item was endorsed in the specific group of individuals you requested as well. There is a third type of item-level information that is available, that of user-designated item information. This information would not appear on all the score reports, only appearing in cases where you as a test user or your organization have identified MMPI-2 RF item content that is of particular interest to you in the setting in which you are working. If this type of item-level information has been requested during the scoring process, you will see the same types of information that is provided for the critical response items. Let's turn now to a short video describing the types of customizable options available on the MMPI-2 RF score report.
There are two primary ways in which we can customize MMPI-2 RF computer-generated reports. One is through use of comparison groups. We have a broad range of comparison groups that are described in the technical manual for the inventory, representing different settings where the test is in use, including various mental health settings, inpatient, outpatient, VA hospitals, as well as various medical settings, pre-surgical candidates for bariatric surgery, spine surgery, chronic pain setting as well. We also have some forensic settings, criminal defendants, disability claimants, neuropsych evaluees, And we also have a very large prison comparison group, as well as some personnel screening comparison groups. So when you print the results for a test taker, you can print just the scale scores, or you can add any of our available comparison groups. In fact, you can even create what we call a custom comparison group, where you take information or data on cases that you've seen or that you've accumulated and create your own comparison group and see how a test taker's scores compare with that comparison group that you created or any of our available standard comparison groups. It just gives us another perspective, not only how does this individual function in reference to our normative sample, which is reflected in their T-scores, but also how they compare with others tested in a similar setting or under similar circumstances. We also have some options for customizing the item level information that you receive from a report. By default, if a test taker produces a clinically elevated scores on one of 7 scales that we've deemed have critical content, then the items that generated that elevation will be printed under the critical responses heading in the report. But sometimes you may be interested in getting item level information for scales other than the 7 that we've designated, or using lower than the clinical cutoff. For example, if you're working in a public safety setting and doing a pre-employment evaluation, we interpret scores below 65 as having significance in those assessments. So being able to customize and determine for any single report what information you'd like to obtain is one of the strengths and flexibility that you find in the scoring software for the MMPI 2RF.
As Dr. Ben Porath just described, there are 2 ways to customize a score report. The first of these is through the use of comparison groups, either standard comparison groups described in Appendix D of the technical manual, or a user-customized comparison group generated from test responses of individuals seen in your particular setting. Customizable comparison groups are available for both score and interpretive reports. The second of the customizable report options is user-designated item-level information. The user-designated information that you can request for item-level information can either be the inclusion of other critical responses content or adjustment of cut scores required for scale interpretation. The inclusion of either the standard or user-customized comparison groups, as well as user-designated item-level information, is an option on the report configuration menu of the test scoring software at the time of reporting. Additionally, comparison groups or user-designated item-level information can be added or changed for a specific report. In this case, the score report would be regenerated at no additional charge to you as a test user. Displayed on this slide is a page from the score report that includes comparison group data, specifically the data from the Psychiatric Inpatient Comparison Group, MEN. We'll see information about how this comparison group scores in the circled part of the score report. The first additional information that will be included is in the numerical and graphical display of mean scores. Specifically, you will be provided information about the mean of the comparison group on specific scales in both numerical and graphic formats, which has been highlighted for you on this slide. The second piece of additional information that will be included is the standard deviation in both graphical and numeric formats. Numerically, this information is presented immediately below the comparison group mean. Graphically, this information appears as the shaded gray bars in the profile. These bars represent the range of scores occurring in the comparison group, 1 standard deviation above and below the comparison group mean. The last piece of additional information that will be included is the percentage of individuals in the comparison group who scored at or below the test taker on each specific scale. This allows for you to see how test takers' responses compare to the selected comparison group in numeric terms similar to, but not exactly the same as percentiles. It is also possible to include custom comparison group, which allows a test user or organization to include comparison group data like those I just showed you, but specific to the setting in which you are using the test. To create these groups, you need at least 200 valid cases who have completed either the MMPI-2 or the restructured form. These custom comparison groups can be shared amongst anyone using the digital platforms within your organization. To find out more about setting up a custom comparison group, please watch the video tutorial linked to this slide. You can alternatively find instructions within either Q platform help function. As I mentioned earlier, you can also customize the score report by including user-designated item-level information. The menu from the digital scoring software to do this is displayed here for you. Recall that only selected scales were designated by the test developers as having critical item responses, and that all substantive scores and default cut scores for interpreting a substantive scale is 65 T-score. Using this menu, you can add item content to be displayed by selecting a particular scale that is of interest to you in your setting to see item content for. You can also lower the threshold required for interpretation by selecting one of the alternative cut score radial buttons. These features may be useful in certain settings. For example, for those of you who work in medical settings, you may want to know the types of somatic difficulties the test taker endorsed experiencing, which could allow you to match these up to difficulties described in their medical history. In this case, you could elect to have item responses for RC1, which assesses somatic concerns, displayed in the user-designated critical responses. Alternative cut scores could be useful to those of you working in personnel selection settings, where using a lower cut score would continue to provide meaningful information about the test taker. Indeed, this is exactly the kind of score adjustment that was done for the police candidate interpretive reports. As previous research demonstrates, there's meaningful information about a candidate available from scores lower than 65. Let's turn now to looking at the clinical interpretive report, which contains all the information included in the basic score report, plus a computer-generated interpretation. Displayed here for you is the first page of this report. The first 7 pages of the interpretive report, including this one, are identical to those provided in the basic score report. As in the score report, pages 2 through 6 provide the numerical and graphical display of a test taker's scores and can include comparison group information. These score reports include the validity scales, the higher order and restructured clinical scales, the somatic and interpersonal specific problems scales, the externalizing and interpersonal specific problems and interest scales, the Sci-5 scales, and the score summary page organized by domain. The next portion of the interpretive report is the computer-generated interpretation, which begins on page 8. The interpretation begins with a synopsis, which provides an overview of the main findings for this specific test taker. This is followed by an analysis of the validity of the protocol using recommended strategies for evaluating response styles, including considering non-content responsiveness, followed by content-based invalid responding. Following that is the interpretation of the substantive scales. Here we see the first page of the interpretive section of the report. Depending on the number of scale scores the test taker achieved an elevation on, the interpretation might spill over 2 or more pages. For this particular individual, the interpretive section of the report consists of 3 pages. These interpretations are organized into different domains assessed by the substantive restructured form scales and are thus presented using the suggested framework for the interpretation described in Chapter 5 of the Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation. These domains include somatic cognitive dysfunction, emotional dysfunction, thought dysfunction, behavioral dysfunction, interpersonal functioning, and moving to the second page for this particular test taker, the interest scales. Following the domain interpretations, the interpretive report will narrow to focus on diagnostic considerations, followed by treatment considerations. There are several types of treatment interpretations that can be included. These are areas in need of further evaluation, and moving to the third page of the interpretive section for this test taker's report, also statements regarding potential considerations for therapeutic process and treatment targets. I've zoomed in here on one of the pages in the interpretation provided in the interpretive report. There are 3 types of statements that will be included in these interpretive statements. The first are statements containing the word reports. These are based on MMPI 2RF item content. The second are statements that contain the word likely. These are based on empirical correlates. Finally, there are statements based on inferences based on the report author's judgments. The interpretive report also explicitly provides information about the MMPI-2RF scores that led to a specific interpretive statement being included, as well as the source of that interpretation. You see that each statement is followed by a superscript number. These numbers correspond to the scale scores that resulted in the interpretation being included and the source from which the interpretation came. The complete list of sources will be provided in the endnote sections of the report. For example, if we focus on the somatic cognitive dysfunction domain interpretations, we see the first interpretation, that the test taker reports a diffuse pattern of cognitive difficulties. This statement comes from source 2. We could also turn to the endnotes page of the interpretive report and see that the interpretation is based on the responses provided by the test taker to items on the cognitive complaints scale. We could go through a similar process for the next statement in the interpretive report about the likelihood that the test taker is experiencing memory problems, having poor frustration tolerance, difficulties coping with stress, and problems with concentration. In this case, we would see that these interpretations were also provided due to the test taker's score on the cognitive complaint scale, but in this case, the statements are based on the empirical correlates for the scale. Turning back to the broader overview of the interpretive report, the report next contains the item level information. As with the score report, the interpretive report includes information about unscorable responses, critical responses, and user-designated item information. The next page in the interpretive report is the endnotes page. There's one aspect of the endnotes page I did not describe for you when I showed you how these endnotes were connected to the specific interpretations. Each endnote that connects an interpretation to an empirical correlate is also associated with a research reference, supporting that a scale score can be used to assess the characteristic described in the interpretive statement. The numbered list of research references are found on the last 2 pages of the report, which I will show you now. Here we see the final pages of the interpretive report that provide the numeric list of the research references that were included in the endnotes. This list will be specific to each test taker's report, as it will only include references that correspond to the specific interpretive statements that were made for that individual. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, there are also interpretive reports available for police candidates and spine surgery and spinal cord stimulator candidates. Both of these interpretive reports are structured similarly to the interpretive report I just described, in that they provide a full score information and an integrated interpretation for each test taker. However, these reports are intended for use in a specific type of evaluation. Broadly, the police candidate interpretive report is intended to provide information specifically relevant to screening police candidates. The police officer interpretive report includes comparison group data from more than 2,000 police candidates assessed throughout North America, facilitating comparison of a candidate's test results to other candidates. This report also contains specific guidance on how to detect a candidate who is presenting themselves in an overly positive light, as well as what the implications of this response style are for the assessment. The report then focuses on identifying behavioral and personality characteristics documented in published scientific research to be associated with ineffective performance on the job. Potential problems in 10 job-relevant domains are identified. And finally, as with the other interpretive report, the PCIR offers comprehensive, transparent annotations and research references for all interpretive statements. The spine surgery and spinal cord stimulator candidate interpretive reports are intended to assist in pre-surgical evaluations. When using this report, you will be able to compare a candidate's test results to those of a comparison sample of more than 1,800 spine surgery and spinal cord stimulator candidates. The interpretive section of the report focuses on identifying psychological risk factors from 9 problem domains, and the interpretive statements included highlight areas of potential increased post-surgical risk relative to other candidates, as well as associated treatment-focused recommendations specifically for these pre-surgical populations. Finally, as with other interpretive reports, this report provides comprehensive and transparent annotations and research references for all interpretive statements. Based on the information about the available automated score and interpretive reports I've just presented, it should be clear that there are several advantages to using the digital or hybrid methods of scoring and reporting the MMPI-2RF. These advantages are similar to those outlined for computer-assisted scoring and reporting outlined by Snyder, Whittaker, and Hoover in 1990, who noted that automated scoring and reporting leads to economy of processing and effective use of professional resources. In the case of the MMPI-2RF, automated scoring and reporting is faster and oftentimes cheaper method when compared to hand scoring. They also noted that accuracy and consistency of scoring and implementation of interpretive decision rules is increased when doing automated scoring and reporting. In the case of the restructured form, automated score and interpretive reports ensures that there are no errors in scoring the instrument, and as you've just heard, automated interpretive reports for the restructured form are based on set criteria that guide what types of conclusions are drawn about the test taker. Further, interpretive statements in the automated reports can be clearly linked to a specific test score or scores and were derived from empirical studies on the restructured form scales. Finally, Snyder and colleagues noted that automated scoring and reporting allowed for unlimited storage capacity and indexing, and then retrieval of these findings for the clinical and research literature. As we've discussed for the MMPI-2RF, reports scored using digital methods can be retained indefinitely. Further, interpretive reports provided through digital scoring and reporting methods are directly linked to empirical studies that are identified for the test user in the report. Additionally, using automated scoring and reporting for the restructured form has the additional advantage of meeting criteria proposed for interpretive test use in high-stakes evaluations, such as when results on an instrument are used in providing opinions to the court or in pre-employment screening settings. Specifically, the interpretive reports available for the restructured form and the interpretive statements contained within those reports are based on the findings from empirical research about what a particular scale score indicates, rather than being automated interpretations generated from inferences made by individuals with expertise on an instrument. MMPI-2 interpretive reports also consider the test taker's response style as indicated by their validity scale scores, and interpretations of substantive scale scores are only provided in the report if these scores reach a pre-specified threshold, such as T65 for the substantive scales. Finally, MMPI-2RF score and interpretive reports include information from comparison groups, either the normative sample or one of the comparison samples we discussed earlier. As I mentioned earlier, it is also possible to create a comparison group unique to the specific setting in which you are using the instrument. Thus, automated restructured form reports allow the test user to rely on context-specific normative data when considering restructured form results. This brings us to the end of Unit 4, Administration, Scoring, and Reporting. Please answer the following question to check your knowledge. We're now ready to move on to the last unit in Module 1, where we will briefly discuss setting-specific applications. Let's start by hearing from Dr. Ben Perath.
The MMPI-2RF is a versatile instrument. It's used in a broad range of settings. In mental health settings, it's used as part of a psychodiagnostic evaluation or in treatment planning. It can also be used to monitor treatment progress. In medical settings, the instrument is used in pre-surgical evaluations of bariatric surgery candidates, spine surgery candidates, candidates for spinal cord stimulators, and also in assessing chronic pain patients. In forensic settings, it's used both in the criminal and civil justice systems. On the criminal side, it's used in, for example, evaluations of competency to stand trial. In civil evaluations, it can be used in personal injury determinations, can be used as part of a child custody evaluation, and then the test is also used in public safety settings. It's used in primarily and first and foremost in assessments of candidates for public safety positions, law enforcement, candidates, correction officer candidates, firefighter candidates, can also be used in evaluations of fitness for duty in these and other settings. In all of these settings, what they have in common is that we have a comprehensive research base that's represented in the information in the technical manual, as well as in the many peer-reviewed publications that are available to guide use of the test. So it is a versatile instrument and one that...
As Dr. Ben Perath just mentioned, the MMPI-2RF is a broadband instrument that can be used in a wide range of settings where a comprehensive picture of the test taker's functioning is needed. This includes clinical settings where the MMPI family of instruments have been used since the original MMPI was developed, but also medical, neuropsychological, forensic, correctional, and public safety settings. By clicking on one of the setting boxes on this screen, you can see a sample report from that setting. Each sample will provide a brief overview of the individual being evaluated and the reason for evaluation, as well as the interpretive report based on that person's restructured form responses. This brings us to the end of Unit 5. Please answer the following question to complete the unit. Please provide us with your opinion of how well the objectives for this module were met. To further your learning about the MMPI-2RF, view the module titled Overview and Resources for the MMPI-2RF Independent Study Training Program if you haven't already done so. You'll find information about additional MMPI-2RF training resources available from Pearson and the University of Minnesota Press, many of them complimentary.